a small university in Sweden called the University of Skövde. And I am here today to talk to you about a topic that is pretty near and dear to my heart because I've been working, I did my PhD in this subject. I've been spending the last year continuing my work on it essentially. And I'm going to talk about essentially the barriers between digital games and formal education. And I'm going to describe why I think educational games or game-based learning have kind of gone from this talking point of being this just around the corner revolution that will change the way we educate people to more and more sliding into a more comfortable position being a niche market. And I'm always sort of nervous giving this talk to conferences around different places because I don't know what kind of conference I'm going to land in. I've had many experiences where I land in a conference where everyone is wholeheartedly aboard the hype train and still think that game-based learning is, the new messiah of education, which can be a bit, embarrassing to try to stave that excitement. But from the talks I've heard so far, it seems like you have a very sensible and more pragmatic and I guess nuanced approach to it. So I think I'm in a very welcoming crowd, hopefully. Right. So what I've been spending my PhD and my last half decade of my life doing, I guess, is to try to understand this, why there's such a big difference in how we talk about games or how we have in the past talked about games quite a bit as academics or pundits and kind of theorized what games should be able to do in education. Well, we've talked about their added potential as learning environments because they provide experiential and participatory learning, that they sort of provide a unique environment for student-driven learning where you can explore and try things out for yourself in an individualized way. They can kind of help with increasing retention with perhaps more boring subject matters by being more flashy and motivating, as we've discussed today quite a bit. And so forth. They're more motivating. They cater to the digital natives thing and all that kind of stuff. But when it comes to practice and reality, and when we actually see if have we actually practically or pragmatically achieved all these things, or have we seen these things reflected in real-world application, I would still argue that no, not really. We have a couple of examples here and there where we've kind of started to see traces of these promises we've seen, but we never really reached this widespread saturation or we never really reached all the promises we made about game-based learning in the, let's say, 90s, early 2000s, and even before that. So that's been my work, is trying to understand why this is happening. And my approach to doing this has been sort of a threefold approach. First of all, I've been studying quite a bit what academics and pundits tend to say about games, how they discuss them, and trying to figure out why they make the conclusions they do about the game-based learning's potential in formal education. I've also been working directly with developers to make games for formal education. That is to say, specifically games that target schools and formal educational institutions as their primary customers. And I've been trying to understand their development processes and value chains a bit better. I come from a background in regular game development before this, by the way, so I had some prior preconceptions about how game development worked and all that kind of stuff. And finally, of course, I have spent quite a bit of time working directly with education students, and I've been working directly with teachers and principals and educational organizations to try to take games that we have developed, sort of sometimes in this stage, working with developers making the games, and then seeing what does it actually take realistically and practically for the school to actually be able to start using it. What are the necessary steps and how much do they cost to take? So that's been my approach. So I'll start very briefly by talking about why we talk about game-based learning the way we do, why we have in the past. And this is, of course, a very familiar thing. I don't really have to mention that again. But so historically, I would say the past 4 decades or so, the main core line of discussion surrounding game-based learning has been to draw connections between the natural anatomy or properties of games to sound and good pedagogical principles proven by pedagogical scholars. So, for example, flow theory is often very directly connected to Vygotsky's theory of proximal development, for example, and this is an adaptation where someone has made a very literal translation of the two, essentially. The Kolb's cycle of experiential learning can very easily be mapped directly to video games, because that's essentially how gameplay loops work a lot of the time, is that you have a very concrete experience, let's say in Mario you are killed by a Goomba, you reflect on why that happened, and you reflect on kind of the tool sets you have at hand to maybe make that situation go differently. You make an abstract conceptualization, maybe if I add the jump with the Goomba, I will have a more positive result. Yeah, you did it, you killed it. And then you can sort of move on to a more challenging challenge later. And that's essentially what games are all about too. So there are many sort of natural connections between the anatomy of games and with learning principles. And if we add that to the more sort of, you know, the rhetoric, I'm not going to call it like a theory or actual science, but the rhetoric about digital natives, and that now to engage young people, you know, the millennials' brains, you need to actually activate them in a gamified or interactive way. So that's essentially the theory behind why games should be really good in education. We've made connections between the anatomy of a good game and good learning principles, and we found that if we combine these two in the right way, we might have good learning effects and outcomes. So the thing is, if this is so good and solid and all is well, why do we have this mismatch still? Why haven't we seen this revolution? Why have we seen a very limited amount of actual implementation of these ideas? Yes. Well, there's been a lot of excuses, or not excuses, that's a bit cruel, but a lot of explanations for it that I think are becoming less and less true. First of all, people for a long time kept saying that there are just no good games yet that have actually managed to create educational content that is, you know, engaging, or that the production values are too low and they look too lo-fi and they aren't very attractive. And I would say that explanation becomes increasingly untrue when you see AAA studios and actual game developers making games that, without much imagination, would fit very, very, very well in various different curricula. For example, we have very advanced history simulation games like Europa Universalis that, you know, you can very easily apply in a classroom environment to teach about different alternate histories, or what happened if different powers did different things, or you can just try to recreate historical settings, which would probably be pretty useful in some cases. You have other games such as Skylines, which would probably have quite a few applications areas in civic studies and understanding how societies work and politics and compromises you need to make a society function. And you have games like Sandbox, which is, you know, a very advanced simulation in universe physics, essentially, which would have a myriad of applications in physics classrooms. So there not being any good content out there, or no good games out there, is becoming increasingly, you know, untenable, I think, as an explanation. There's tons of them out there. So another common explanation in the past has been that teachers are just like these dinosaur Luddites that refuse. They both hate fun and they also hate games. And that, I think, is also becoming increasingly untrue. Just to mention a couple of studies, one conducted in 2009 in Europe, for example, polled 500 teachers around various European countries and found that 70% already had tried to use games in school activities, and 60% of the ones who haven't yet tried it really wanted to do so. I think they found that only 10%-ish of teachers actually had a more vocal aversion to games, and that's not really a high number. A similar study done in the US, which polled 1,700 participants, found fairly similar results, where a majority of teachers actually could see games being potentially useful for their work. So this picture of teachers as being, you know, stuck in the 70s in some ways and not really wanting to adapt games because they're scared of them or don't want to use them is not really true either. There's a lot of willing teachers out there who really want to start doing this. So that's why I think this, you know, more simplified view or more isolated view of why games should theoretically be good for learning doesn't really work. It clearly hasn't really led to a good, you know, match between theory and practice. So what I've done in my research is to try to expand on this more isolated view into something that is significantly more complex and almost impossible to read, sadly. But that's essentially more reflective of the reality of the situations, whether there's a bunch of different actors and processes and situational factors and goals that need to align in some ways, but it's very hard to make them do so. So for example, to make something like this happen, like this situation, to just get there, requires an immense amount of like pre-planning, and this whole machinery down here of the mechanics that go into making this sort of thing happen is still not very well understood. And that's what I'm trying to understand. And that's why I now look like some weird forest man, whereas before I was a young, naive person with lively eyes, and I actually quickly was stuck out of me. And I kind of want to share this frustration with you, the audience, today in the interactive segment of this talk. So we're going to start out with a tutorial. It's essentially going to be a very easy voting system, which I'm sure you Swiss are all about the direct democracy, so that's how this is going to work. You're going to get two choices, and I'm going to show two pictures of how you show your hand in the air for what choice you want to do. Okay, so we are going to see if this works. Oh, no audio, but that's fine. So, okay, cool. We need to choose an attack for this Blastoise. This is also going to be a test in your Pokemon knowledge, I guess. So you get to vote on either the Pikachu using a Thunder attack or Mega Punch, okay? So we're going to vote in 3, 2, 1, go. That's good. That's a good Pokemon crowd. Okay, Thunder is pretty overwhelmingly popular, so I'm going with that one. See? You can imagine your own sound effects and whatnot. Okay, cool. Good hit. Oh, pretty good. Okay, super effective. But, you know, the Pikachu won't beat it anyway. It's way too low level. And even making all the right moves, you can still lose. So, such is life. Anyway, good job. So that's the tutorial. That's exactly how this is the controls of this game we're going to play together. Because we are setting up our own little educational game developer. It's a developer simulator, and this is a picture of some castle here in Neuchâtel. So we're going to make a series of 4 choices to develop our educational games. We're going to choose a game engine, we're going to choose a platform of distribution, we're going to choose a game genre or type of game, and then how complex we want the design to be, how deep we want it to be. And again, you do the open hand and closed hand for the voting. Right, so first off, game engine technology. Do we want to work with a very cool looking but perhaps pretty expensive and demanding engine such as Unreal, which looks great, but requires quite a bit of investment, or do we want to do the cheaper and faster option, Game Maker? Okay, 3, 2, 1, go. Okay, I think there's a lot of, oh, that's almost a tie. I'm going with Game Maker for it. That's good. Cool. So this is also like we're going to keep track of the resource investments we're doing during this project by a little slider you see here, where the game can either be super, super cheap, of course, we can just cheap out on everything, but then we don't have a really cool product. But we won't really have much risk if we don't really do very well. Or we can spend a lot of money and get this amazing product that doesn't really, well, that's very risky though if no one buys it. Cool, so the next choice is the platform of distribution. We can either choose a closed platform, just imagine like an iPad or Oculus or VR system or the Nintendo Switch or something that where development is kind of prohibited and there's an entry cost for us to buy the dev kit essentially and work with it. And our target audience will need to have a very specific technology to be able to use it. Or do we want to open one that is a bit cheaper to work with and more scalable and we can distribute to more people, but we might have more issues trying to make things work on different devices. Okay, that's the choices. So 3, 2, 1, go. Okay. All right, closed. That's a good choice. It's a bit more expensive, but that should be fine. People like iPads, people like Nintendos. Okay, so as for the choice of the genre, we either choose an open world experience or a linear focused narrative where we get to tell the player exactly the steps of the story they're going to go through. So the open world, of course, is more adaptive and explorative and maybe more adaptive to different types of learning situations which might be useful, whereas the linear one will be easier to slot into a very specific curriculum and it will specifically teach math, for example, which is more easy to handle perhaps by a teacher. So what do we want, the open world explorative cool one or the linear, also cool, but linear one? Okay, 3, 2, 1, go. Cool, open world. Good so far. Okay, design ethos, and here is the complexity essentially. Do we want a very, very deep game with very intricate game mechanics that you can just spend hours and hours trying to master, or do we want a simple one that is, just plug and play essentially, which most people can pick up? 3, 2, 1. God, that's a tough one. Jesus. Okay, well, I'm going complex, I think. It was almost, you can't really agree on anything. It's troublesome for our studio's future, I think. So we managed to make a game called Dwarf Fortress, essentially, which is visually and engine-wise very rudimentary, I would say. Like it does look like this. It's ASCII graphics. So visually, it won't particularly win any awards unless you're very into pixel art and stuff like that. But for your students who are, in the age of Minecraft players and COD players, that might not really win a lot of favors. So a good thing about Dwarf Fortress, of course, is like it's incredibly complex and deep in its gameplay and very open to user-driven narratives and emergent gameplay. Like you essentially get free reign to construct a society and choose how you're gonna make people survive here, either from the land or from hunting or from warfare and all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of different lessons to be learned from this game. So we essentially made an economic but visually basic game. Which shows us, oh, I'm sorry, did I do the right one? Yes, I did. We developed Dwarf Fortress for the Oculus Rift, I guess, for some reason. And we chose an open user-driven narrative with very complex game mechanics, very deep. So that's a good combination. Now I'm gonna sort of very briefly roleplay or sort of predict how this is gonna be received by teachers and schools. And there's no interaction here, so just sit by and watch your cash roll in as a studio, I guess. So the game engine, being a quick engine, is of course very good. As I mentioned, there's a very low system requirement, so it can likely be installed and used on a wide range of hardware, which is very good. Schools often have very, very old computers, and we want to have as wide of a technological market as possible. The low file size of Dwarf Fortress, of course, means that it's easy to reinstall the game if there's any troubles. It's very quick to update as well. There's no like 50 gig patches or DLC to deal with. And transfers of data or save files will probably also be pretty easy between computers if we need to do backups. And also the smaller development cost when it comes to engine price and art assets and creating those kind of things means that we can put a smaller price tag on it, which makes it more attractive to a wider range of people. Of course, we need to have a very large market segment to make this small price tag worth it, but it's a good compromise. So the minuses, of course, is that production values are pretty low, which might be off-putting for some students, as I mentioned, the millennials who are all about their fidget spinners and Call of Duties, might not really think this is too visually appealing, so the audience or the students who are intended to use this later might actually be a bit frustrated by it. Also, having such a simple engine actually compromises the accuracy of the simulation a little bit. Like, as you saw with Dwarf Fortress, it's very, very, very simple and minimalist. That type of abstraction can be very problematic for teachers because they all constantly have to contextualize and describe things for the students to make sure that everyone is seeing the same game in a certain way so that you can actually glean some, classroom lessons from it. It's very difficult to make a classroom argument or debriefing session if what I saw was a sheep and someone else saw a goblin with that same model. Is very hard to pull civic lessons from that or anything like that. Right. Since we chose a closed platform, chose an iPad or Oculus Rift, we can expect reliable compatibility with the devices because we had the SDK that we needed to make a good game for this specific technology. So we know that in our test sessions in our studio are very representative of the technology they're going to be using. So that's good. We can also know the exact game interface that the game runs and make a more easy, streamlined user experience with downloads and setting things up and stuff like that. However, it significantly limits our market segment since it's a very expensive barrier to entry for users in classrooms. Like PCs might be a bit more common in classrooms still than iPads, for example, or VR technologies especially. Another problem is, of course, that those systems often offer very limited user control. User and game data is often hard to access or maybe behind some sort of locks or firewalls or paywalls, whatever, which makes sharing and backup more difficult. So we kind of have negated the benefits of using a cheap engine by using a closed system because it's going to be difficult, especially, of course, also if it's a system like Uplay or Steam or something else that requires online capabilities in some certain ways and maybe have digital right management tools that makes things even more difficult for you. So the game has some things going for it now, but we're starting to see some problems lining up when it comes to influencing our market segment. So that investment might not have been totally worth it. Okay, as for genre, we chose a very adaptable one, which is good because now we have a very broad market segment in the sense that maybe our game can be applied to mathematics and civic studies and preservation, nature, environmental studies and stuff like that, which is pretty good, and economics or politics and all that kind of stuff. So that's cool. The game can also adapt to individual students' player skills and preferences. Like you can essentially play it as a warlord or as a farmer or as a peaceful leader, which is good. We accommodate for different play styles. The problem with this, of course, is that it increases the need for the teacher to actually describe or ship away parts of the game if they actually want to reach a specific learning outcome, which can be very complicated, and I'm going to go into that a bit in more detail later, actually. And finally, with the design complexity, the game offers, of course, a very in-depth representation of a subject matter, which is very good. It's not just, I don't know if anyone's ever played Dwarf Fortress, but it's not fun, I was going to say, but it's very, very complex. It's like playing Excel in certain ways. Which is good, though, because then we can actually simulate economic systems with a very high degree of accuracy, and we can simulate environmental wear and tear with a very high degree of accuracy instead of just being very, very simple. In comparison to, for example, Minecraft, that has a very cool flowing environment, but nothing really happens with it. There's no real realistic wear and tear. I haven't played it in a while, but I assume that's still the case. So understanding all these games' complexities can also be good because the game now has a longer lifespan for your students. Like it can take a while to master all of it, and it's fun to explore and try to get better at it, as opposed to a very simple game. The problem, of course, here is that with complexity is that students and teachers as well don't always, or often, I would say, have a very high gaming literacy. So this would be a very high barrier to entry to start using the game in the classroom to begin with. Complex mechanics often mean that a lot of time needs to be spent on tutorials and game controls rather than actually, sinking your teeth into the educational material of the game right away. You need to start talking about the user interface and the complexities of it a couple of hours before you can even start doing some actual learning, which can be frustrating. Cool. Just through this little simulation, and we have some idea of return on that. There's a lot of compromises and concessions that has to be made when it comes to game development and then the use of games as well. Oftentimes when you choose one positive, it comes with a couple of negatives as well, which cancel each other out, which is very complex. And for educators, most games, or all those minuses I lined up earlier, are just one or two of those are usually enough for them to just not want to use it. Because we need to also realize that we are not entering like a barren, blue ocean market where there are no teaching tools, and we are creating the first one. And if this is good, then we're fine. We want to be better and more accessible and useful than the tools that are already available. So schools, of course, already use books and presentations and traditional teaching materials that are in some ways limited, but they are at least very easy to use. Like a book won't need a patch to be opened, for example, and it won't suddenly crash and your whole curriculum plan will be out the window one day. It's very easy to open, it's very accessible and very quick. It's also easy to bring home with you, and it doesn't really have any DRM issues with it. So the good thing about games, of course, is that they have those added educational values, or a lot of them are hypothesized, but they do have some, like retention and length of participation and experiential and active learning and so forth. But of course, then we go into the problems like that small bonus might actually require quite a few hurdles to get into. Like education needs to invest quite a bit to even get to the point where they get maybe a small boost in the educational potential. And a lot of educators aren't really willing to make that sacrifice because it is sizable. It's very, very difficult. Me being in classrooms, trying to work with teachers, being sort of tech savvy, for me also, it oftentimes felt pretty, not really worth the price of admission. Development and purchasing cost of game, of course, is very expensive as compared to other types of teaching tools. Implementation processes can be lengthy and difficult. You need to sort of prepare your IT structure and IT department to do the maintenance and make sure that the infrastructure works every day, and so forth and so forth. Like we even saw this just half an hour ago, like in this room that is very equipped for this exact thing to go smoothly. We had some issues that made this talk start 12 minutes late. That's not really feasible to expect teachers to just deal with. If they have 40 minutes or 60 minutes with students each day to teach them math and reach a very specific goal in that curriculum, they can't just shrug and go, well, I lost 15-20% of my classroom time today. Not really acceptable. So they will not want to use those tools unless you can show extreme reliability. That's just one example. So it's good that it happened. It kind of helped with my argument a little bit. So if we also take stuff like open world games, like Minecraft is, as far as educational games go, is pretty cool. It does well for what it does. The problem with those open world games and the one we chose, Dwarf Fortress, is like since they are so open and complex, actually mining out one specific lesson from them is almost impossible or very, very difficult. And it takes a high amount of gaming literacy or knowledge with a game or familiarity with it to know which part or which branches of this tree we want to shear off to get to exactly what we want. Like, it becomes a lesson in trying to tell students to not engage with the redstone this time, or not engage with the lava, or not engage with the bow and arrow mechanics, because we want to do volumetric cubes to teach math, for example. It takes a lot of knowledge from the teacher, and it takes a lot of supervision during a classroom session to make that work, and so forth. And yeah, it's just another dot for some reason. And all of that can feel like wasted work sometimes for developers and teachers. For example, with just this presentation and the very, very simple interactions we just did, I created 98 slides that you will never see, just on the off chance that you would land on that interactive moment. That's a lot of time I could perhaps spend just doing, these, 30-ish slides better. But instead I made 129 of them that are, mediocre, as you can see. No, they're fine. But they could be better, of course. So that's also a trade-off, where giving up authorial control means that you invite a whole host of complexities to the situation. As Bernard was talking about earlier, for example, with the interactive game books, like, we saw 6 examples of narrative developments there, but I'm sure there's like 29 just to tell that, other ones just to tell that simple story that you had to write somewhere, and that's a lot of asset creation that can be expensive, just to never be seen. So that can be frustrating. Okay, so return on investment for developers looks almost, well, not the opposite, but it's kind of a weird situation there too. As I mentioned before, like, if we inflate developer cost to create something super cool with Unreal Engine and just make it open world and super complex, yeah, that actually reduces the potential market we can reach with our game, because the technological sophistication will immediately cut out several schools to participate, just depending on their technological infrastructure. A lot of them have a very poor one, for example, which means that our consumer market will be smaller the more we spend, which means that we need to increase the price tag of our games, which further alienates a lot of schools that might not have that type of resource. And it also increases the expectations of what our game is going to deliver. So it's kind of a weird, toxic circle we enter at that point. Yeah, so another strategy for this is to just decrease development costs as much as possible and make something super cheap. We just do the cheapest engine. We crap something out in a week or two on Game Maker that contains maths in some way, but isn't very engaging. That, of course, will be off-putting and not very attractive. So while we might sell more copies feasibly because it's more easy to install and easy to use and easier to slot into a curriculum, the lifespan of the thing will be very short and limited because it's such a simple product that people won't really want to pay a lot of money for it, which also puts us as developers in a very tricky situation where we won't really, it's going to be hard for us to recoup even that small investment. So this is where a lot of the tensions between educational, formal education and games comes from, is that what teachers want and need is almost at the direct opposite of what game developers can create. Or if the developers try to create that, that goes straight against what the teachers actually want for games to be useful. So that's why we see most games being done today is tailor-made games, where, for example, one teacher or a school or a municipality gets grant money to create a specific game for a specific curriculum. So a school and a game studio teams up to create this perfectly adapted game that works in that teaching environment, but no other school. So there's no market, but you made one solid product, I guess. The other approach to do that is to take the Minecraft approach or the Dwarf Fortress approach, which is to make an adaptable game that is multifaceted so that it can fit into many different teaching styles, many different curricula. For example, the Swiss curricula, I'm sure, is way different from the Swedish one. So if we made a tailor-made game, we could probably only launch it in Switzerland or Sweden, not both. An adaptable game tries to create this global market impact, for example. But again, that increases the complexity, that increases the barrier to entry and the gaming literacy required to use it. So again, we expand the market at the same time as we very strongly narrow it down. So it is not really easy way to win this game. Because things that we as, I'm sure a lot of people in here play video games quite a bit, or we as industry people and academics, the positive traits we can assign to games have an equal and opposite counterpart, which is negative. If we make a powerful and complex game, we might call it emergent and complex and deep on a theoretical level, or when we play it at home. But that same, those same characteristics come with a negative trait for teachers, for example. It can require high game literacy to use, as I mentioned. It can be very obfuscatory or cluttered for people who aren't used to games, and it can require quite a bit of solid computers and technology to use it, to even meet the system requirements. And there's like things on all sides of this board, for example, different things. Right. So this is a quote I quite like that kind of summarizes this whole thing. So maybe I should just have left this here and walked out the room. But in 2013, a couple of scholars did a, I think, very interesting study on creating their own game and then trying to make it work in classroom situations. And the game they made is actually visually pretty impressive. Like, this is 2013, and as far as serious games and educational games go, I think this is a pretty well-made one. And they also were very adamant about including teachers in their development process to make sure that they fit educational goals. So it's all in all, like, as good as a project you can hope for, and as good as a project you can hope for in 2013. But their conclusion of their whole study was that essentially when trying to start using this game in schools, they realized that they kept encountering problem after problem after problem that made this game very difficult to use. So they conclude that a larger research question arises from the fact that our research suggests that the formal educational use of game requires a significant amount of learning process management through a teacher or trainer. So the first thing they noticed was like the game itself didn't really teach people unless the teacher was standing by them or had debriefings after the gaming sessions to tell them or contextualize or discuss the things they experienced to actually get something reflective and good out of it. So this contradicts opinions that games are excellent tools for self-directed learning. The learning doesn't happen in the game. It's when you break flow, essentially, take the players out of it and say, what did you experience? Let's reflect upon this and discuss it. That's when learning happens, which I agree with quite a bit. And I think there's more and more theories now coming out that says that flow might be great for game design and being totally enthralled in something, but it's not as great for actual learning and reflection. But the thing they conclude with is what I think is particularly interesting, which is that it is difficult, if not impossible, to achieve economies of scale in educational game development, which means that all those things I mentioned that makes the school market so fragmented, that every single school has their own curricula, their own teaching processes, every teacher has their own preferences, students are a very tricky audience to work with. All those things and technological infrastructures and capabilities make the market so fragmented that it is impossible to make one game that can be used in a wide enough array of schools to actually return a positive return on investment for you as a developer. It just won't work. And in my research, which I primarily conducted in, I stopped in 2016, I guess, so a few years later, that was still very much true. Right, so our studio, we're bankrupt, I guess. We did all right, but not good enough. We also rented a castle for a startup, which is always a bad investment, I think. Okay, right. So if things are so difficult, where did game-based learning optimism come from, I guess, is the question. And that's what I kind of spent the first couple of my years trying to figure out, because I was frustrated too. I entered the field of game-based learning and serious games with a game development background. And I came in thinking, well, I know game design and game development quite well. I just need to make this killer app and cool game that people are gonna love, and I'm gonna do it right because no one else has before. That was my attitude coming into it, because that's what all the rhetoric is. That's what you hear. And when you realize that, well, no, your game actually has almost nothing to do with the success of it. Like the cleverness of the game design is disappearingly small, a bottleneck as compared to technological implementation, reliability, and practical matters of economy, which is disheartening as a game designer to hear, of course. So the question then is, how did we ever think game-based learning would work as well as it should in formal education? Well, again, the machinery is very complex. It requires a very knowledgeable teacher and students who actually know how to play these games. It requires quite a bit of sophisticated hardware to be able to run everything fairly reliably. It also required quite a bit of time investment to prepare lesson times and to maybe rejigger your own thinking as a teacher to, well, I'm gonna translate all of my math curricula that I used to do with pen and paper, I'm gonna translate that into Minecraft or something else. It takes quite a bit of time. And of course, just overall resource investments need to be higher because maintenance costs increase for IT departments and all that kind of stuff. And as most people know, like schools aren't that rich, at least public schools, which is what I worked in primarily. So this won't really happen. And so far, we've kind of obfuscated this. It's been a black box. And we've only talked about the benefits, of course. And the reason we've been able to do that is like me as a researcher walking into a classroom starting to study a game. I come in there with my game expertise and I help teachers and I tutor them and I make them understand the game content better and maybe help them construct a curricula. I often bring in my own hardware if they don't have it. I bring in iPads or laptops because that's what I need to be able to study something. I devote my own time and my own resources to it. And that, of course, creates a very, very skewed understanding of what games actually can do. And I think that artificial environment that we create to study games is why we are at the point we are. Because when teachers that I work with, like I worked with them for like maybe 8 months to work with games in their and technology in their education. I was there several times a week just tutoring them and teaching them how to do things. And as soon as I left that classroom, I learned that a week after I left, they had stopped using the game altogether because of a patching issue, essentially, or some very simple issue that they didn't really want to spend a lot of time working out. So they even started, they were very surprised that things worked very well when I was there, but then when they were only going to start using stuff like Word, the computers wouldn't really start up and the network would be very unreliable, so they had immediately started on technology again. Like a teacher doesn't have time to do tech support for 30 different computers every day to make sure all the computers work, so they won't be doing it. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit just to make sure I reach the end. Okay. Another issue, I think, is, of course, the classroom audience is far from as homogeneous as we think. Like, digital natives isn't really a thing. So stepping your foot in a classroom immediately proves that everyone has different skill levels. And that makes it very, very difficult to work with. If we subscribe to flow theory as a sound design process, then what we essentially need to achieve as game designers is a game that caters to every single conceivable level of skill and preference to make sure that all of the 30 kids in our classroom actually enjoys the game in a sort of equal way and can participate in it. It's very, very difficult to do. I know someone mentioned this in the round table earlier, but making a good game, period, just for entertainment is very, very challenging. But then making one with a rapt audience with very different preferences becomes incredibly difficult. So I think that's why this like artificial environments and these, not really talking about these very banal practicalities of games is why we have this situation where from 2003 onward we've complained about why schools are missing out on opportunities and we don't really understand why that's happening. In 2008 it's happening again, that research ignores the more practical and self-evident problems in using games in educational settings. Again, 2011, there's very little evidence of games actually working. And again, 2015, like it happens again and again and again. And I think now we're landing in a place where we're starting to accept that games won't really work the way we always hoped they would. And maybe it's time to accept that there will be a niche product, more so than a revolution. And that's what I've been trying to do with my PhD thesis and this whole complicated model. I've been trying to suss out different objectives we want to reach with games, the processes we need to apply to reach them, the stakeholders and actors involved in trying to make that happen, and all the complicating situational factors in different schools that make it more difficult. And this is, of course, all not very, encouraging. So, but I will say that what Stefan said earlier, that this is a country full of potential in this domain, and I think Europe in general is a continent full of potential in this domain. It just has to be a shifting of thinking from talking about these lofty theoretical goals and actually starting to take the realities and respect them a little bit more, I guess. They're not as sexy and cool to talk about. Like, no TED talk is going to be titled "Why Computers Are Difficult Sometimes." Like, that's not a good eye-catching thing to do. But we need to actually start respecting and treating or talking about those things a bit more if we actually want games to do anything in education, except for, in those chosen very niche situations in very rich, luxurious schools, for example, or with teachers who are already very good at using games. If we want widespread implementation, we need to calm down a little bit. Right, I think that's what I have. Thank you very much.
Is it working? Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Björn. We have some time for some few questions, please.
Do we have an idea how many teachers are actually also gamers, and from this part, how many are also hobbyist developers? It can also explain why why it's a niche market.
Sorry, how do you mean? Like if there's teachers who can?
Teachers also. So how many teachers are also gamers, real gamers, not
right.
Casual gamers?
That's
and also hobbyist developers. There are also some teachers that are developers themselves.
That's a great point. I think a large part of this solution or ending this stalemate that we have is that we need way more cross-pollination between the two. Like there are, of course, chosen specific examples all across Europe, which like one teacher who was a gamer beforehand and games on his own time or her own time, who takes those things that they are already very proficient in and puts them in a classroom context in some ways. That does happen. What I'm talking about is like this widespread or accessible thing where any teacher would be able to pick up a game. Won't really happen. But no, I agree. Like there's some teachers who are also gamers, and that seems to work okay. There's still quite a bit of an uphill battle, and it takes a lot of passion for them to do it. And it's the same with a lot of developers start out that all have educational backgrounds, want to create something that fits more in the educational environment they want. But they also encounter problems because their experience as educators are not necessarily representative of everyone's experience as an educator. So I've noticed quite a bit when an educator tries to make a game, they remember their time in the classroom and their physical setup and their hardware and their students, and they make a game thinking that that's going to be applicable to other settings. But what I've found in just the same school in two different classrooms, like it's so incredibly different that it's impossible to work the same way in even neighboring classrooms. The processes are so different that it doesn't really work anyway. So it can be a bit disheartening for them too, sadly.
Hey, thanks for the talk. I was wondering if you had any insight and looked into regular board games vs video games in that matter.
I'm very glad you mentioned that, because I'm a very big proponent of, you don't need to go digital. You don't need to go high tech to start experimenting with what gaming can contribute to your classroom. I actually think a lot of teachers or a lot of governments even do themselves a great disservice by starting out by being like, we heard there's games on the iPad, here's an iPad, try to use it. That's the horrible way to do it. Where it works is when you go low tech and start experimenting with a very low investment threshold and start being more comfortable doing things that way. So absolutely, board games would be the way to do it if you're unfamiliar with it beforehand. I say still, like, you don't need digitalization in most cases in a way. It's just unnecessary fluff, and maybe even it might even be counter productive for learning, because in a lot of digital games, for example, if you take digital chess versus real board game chess, digital chess apps always give you the potential moves you can do. Like they highlight little squares and be like, they tell you the rules continuously, so you don't have to keep them in your head. And in some learning situations, that's the worst thing you can do, because the whole point is that you're supposed to do mental arithmetic, or you're supposed to like continuously reevaluate or think or reflect about rules. So I would say digital versions of board games sometimes are way worse than their physical counterparts when it comes to actually being positive for educational purposes.
Hey, I got a question about, first of all, thank you. Really enlightening talk. It put to words so many things I've been thinking about, and really great. I'm curious about, you've kind of basically been talking about using them within the classroom setting. Have you done some thought about just within, like, as a homework assignment, using games in that sense? Because then it kind of frees up some of those issues potentially.
Well, so do you mean homework assignment, specifically the teacher assigning, you're going to play this game at home later, and then come
For example,
okay,
play one level of blah, blah, blah.
Because I would say, first of all, like informal use of games, I think my research doesn't explain that at all. I think that's a completely different ballgame. because then you're allowed like infinite time essentially, and hoping that someone maybe incidentally picks up something from playing Magic the Gathering or something.
I feel like it speaks to the medium, especially in the open.
Yeah, for sure. So the thing with teachers doing that, well, of course, it alleviates the school from having to make all those investments in technology and frees up the teacher time to do other things, and doesn't, take up valuable classroom times with troubleshooting. But I would say that I don't know how fair it is to students, because the students I've been working with, for example, have very varying degrees of, let's say, just socioeconomically speaking, socioculturally speaking, like their home life is differently conducive to using computers. Some families still don't really have capable technologies. Some people don't really have, let's say, tech literate parents that can help them out if something goes wrong or something like that. So I would say, as all teaching tools, of course, are a bit unfair. Not everyone is as proficient at reading, not everyone is as proficient at different things. But I think technology often exacerbates or like hyper sort of just inflates issues that we already have with current teaching tools when it comes to fairness and just how participating in things in an equal way, which I think is complex and very interesting. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's like the next step of my research, it's talking about those socioeconomic culture factors. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Here is a little gift.
Oh, cool.
Please, you still have some wine or so, so you can get drunk at this.
Fantastic, thank you.
If you're too sad. Okay, great. Thank you so much. I suppose that you will have plenty of time to talk with Björn and ask him as many questions as you want. Please welcome. Please, just tell me your pronunciation of your name. Shaban Chameh, who will lead the next session. So.
Thanks for the help.
Hello, thank you. I'm from the company Everdreamsoft, and I'm the producer of the game Spells of Genesis. And I'm happy to host today a discussion about something important. Working in games is often art. It's coming out of passion, and sometimes we need to discuss about hard things like money and business. And I'm very happy to have people who will explain their experience in that particular field that is very important for our industry. So, do I call them right now?